In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delves into the political landscape surrounding Kamala Harris's acceptance of the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. The discussion is marked by a critical examination of Harris's campaign strategy, her past political record, and the media's portrayal of her candidacy. Shapiro begins by highlighting the seemingly sudden emergence of Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, suggesting that she has not been a significant player in American politics until now. He emphasizes that her tenure as vice president has not been marked by any notable achievements or policies, framing her as a figure who has been largely absent from the political discourse. He sarcastically notes that Harris appears to have materialized out of nowhere, fully formed but devoid of any concrete positions. The podcast takes a critical stance on Harris's political history, particularly her time as a senator and her role in the Biden administration. Shapiro argues that Harris has been complicit in the policies of the current administration, particularly regarding inflation and foreign policy. He asserts that Harris's claims of being a fresh face in politics are disingenuous, given her long-standing involvement in government. He points out that Harris was the last person in the room during significant decisions, errors such as the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and therefore cannot distance herself from the consequences of those actions. Shapiro expresses frustration with the media's enthusiastic coverage of Harris's speech at the Democratic National Convention. He describes the media's reaction as overly effusive, likening it to a form of self-indulgence. He reads excerpts from a column praising Harris's speech, mocking the language used to describe her performance. He argues that the media's portrayal of Harris as a transformative figure is misleading, as it ignores her actual record and the challenges facing the country. Throughout the podcast, Shapiro emphasizes the disconnect between Harris's rhetoric and the reality of her policies. He argues that her campaign is built on vague promises and platitudes rather than concrete plans. He points out that Harris's focus on vibes and emotional appeals is a deliberate strategy to distract from her lack of substantive policy proposals. He criticizes the Democratic Party for prioritizing identity politics and emotional resonance over actual governance. The discussion also touches on the role of identity politics in Harris's campaign. Shapiro argues that Harris's identity as a woman of color is being leveraged to garner support, but he questions whether this is enough to win over voters. He suggests that the Democratic Party is banking on Harris's identity to create a narrative of progress and inclusivity, while failing to address the substantive issues facing the country. Shapiro expresses skepticism about whether voters will be swayed by identity alone, especially in light of the pressing economic and social challenges. A significant portion of the podcast is dedicated to Harris's stance on abortion, which Shapiro characterizes as a central tenet of her campaign. He argues that Harris's framing of abortion rights as a fundamental aspect of freedom is a strategic move to rally support among progressive voters. Shapiro critiques this approach, suggesting that it oversimplifies a complex issue and ignores the concerns of those who may not align with the Democratic Party's position on abortion. The podcast also addresses Harris's foreign policy positions, particularly her comments on Israel and Palestine. Shapiro notes that Harris attempts to appeal to both pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian audiences, but he argues that this approach lacks sincerity and clarity. He suggests that Harris's statements are designed to placate various factions within the Democratic Party rather than reflect a coherent foreign policy strategy. He expresses concern that this lack of clarity could have serious implications for U.S. foreign relations. Shapiro concludes the podcast by reflecting on the broader implications of Harris's candidacy for the Democratic Party. He expresses concern that the party is becoming increasingly disconnected from the needs and concerns of everyday Americans. He argues that the focus on identity politics and emotional appeals may ultimately alienate voters who are looking for substantive solutions to pressing issues. He suggests that the Democratic Party must reevaluate its approach if it hopes to remain relevant in the coming elections.